Last night, my brother called me. My brother is a doctor in the emergency room in Baylor in Dallas. And he was there when the victims of the shootings in Dallas were brought in. He was one of the two physicians on duty when they arrived. He's been an ER doc for 30 years, something like that. And he said that he was really surprised by the fact that over the intervening 24 or 48 hours, however long it was, he'd gotten a whole bunch of calls from people saying, "Are you okay?" And he goes, "I don't get this. I've dealt with multiple trauma events before. Why is everybody worried about whether I'm okay?" And I said, "It's because they've been traumatized and they're projecting their trauma onto you and saying, 'I'm not okay. How are you doing?'" Because we all have suffered a level of trauma here. We've gotten into a society now where we can sit there and watch somebody get killed on a cell phone video, watch him bleed out. We sit there and we have repeated cases where we're like, well, what went wrong there? And now we see how things oscillate back and forth, and when somebody's a little twisted or a little evil or whatever we want to call it, then we get a bunch of people killed. Now, I have in the past quoted Archbishop William Temple to the effect that I don't believe in coincidences. When I pray to God, coincidences happen, and when I don't, they don't, is what William Temple said. But I heard an even better quotation this morning, and I don't know the source, but it was saying that coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. So let's just look at a little coincidence today. We sit here and we see in our nation some trauma, and we worry about where's the center, how can the center hold, are things falling apart, are we getting further polarized, what's going on? And we have a gospel lesson that says, "And who is my neighbor?" Now let's put that in context. Because the lawyer, you will note, first of all it says he was seeking to justify himself, but the lawyer, you will note, correctly answers Jesus' question. Jesus says, "You've given the right answer. Do this and you shall live." He summarizes, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. Talking about the two dimensions of how we're supposed to live, the vertical with God and the horizontal with each other. And if the two ever get separated, we're in trouble. They have to meet at the cross. He answers the question right. But then he goes, "And who is my neighbor?" Now, why would he ask that question? Notice that Luke never tells us what the lawyer does after Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." We're left to speculate on that, the way Luke always does that to us, because we're supposed to say, "I'm the lawyer, what am I going to go do? What am I doing?" But when the lawyer asks, "Who is my neighbor?" he's saying, who do I have an obligation to? Who do I owe a duty to? Are they in or out? Are they part of the community, my community, or not? And Jesus, in answering his question, gives an illustration. And the illustration involves a Samaritan. Now, in our day and age, we're used to the term Samaritan, Good Samaritan, as somebody who does good works. But the Samaritans are actual people, okay? When the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians and the Jews were taken off into captivity, and then they were brought back by the Persians, there was a whole bunch of history going on there over centuries. And then about 3 centuries before Jesus was born, Alexander the Great came through and conquered people all the way to the east until he died in Afghanistan. And when Alexander died, his empire was divided up by 4 of his generals. These became known as the Ptolemies, or the Seleucid dynasties. The one who ruled in the Mid-East, in what is now Palestine, Jerusalem, all those areas, he decided that the Jews were kind of a problem, and he needed to make them un-Jewish. So he tried to convert them to the Greek pagan religion. First thing he did was he sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. It's supposed to get their attention. When that didn't work, he started importing foreign people to live in the area. And the people he brought in became the Samaritans. They were from a part of the world that is now northern Kurdistan, so they were quite foreign to the Jews. But once they got to Palestine, they were like, we think the Jews are actually worshiping the one true God. So they started worshiping God. They're still around, incidentally. There's not too many of them left. They have a slightly separate Old Testament Bible. It's called the Samaritan Canon. But the Jews always considered them like those people, unclean, not my neighbor, not part of my community. And so Jesus, in answering the lawyer's question, sits there and says, well, you got a priest. Well, he's part of you, right? He's special. You got a Levite. He's part of you. He's in the power structure. Then you got this Samaritan, one of those guys. Jesus, in answering the lawyer's question, focuses on the fact that the lawyer is looking at obligation and duty. To whom do I owe some kind of obligation under the law? And Jesus answers the question by saying, to whom can you show love? Which is what the Samaritan does to the man who has been set upon by robbers. So let's put that in our context today. The question becomes, to whom can I show love? Doesn't mean I have to agree with him or her. Doesn't mean I have to sit there and say, oh, well, this is the way this case happened, and that's the way that case happened. That's why we have courts, folks, okay? Sooner or later, things do get sorted out on some legal basis. But when we sit there and see protesters, for example, and say, well, I agree with them or I don't agree with them, the question is, are they my neighbor? Well, yes. If I'm serious about the baptismal vows I took that say, I will seek and serve Christ in all persons. I will respect the dignity of every human being and work for justice, freedom, and peace. But if I focus on working for justice, freedom, and peace and say, I'm going to do this using my own resources because I'm a good guy, I'll fail. It has to be God's resources, which are infinite, that we can deploy by being in Christ. Now, locally, we've seen, thanks be to God, nothing like what happened in Dallas. But I'll tell you about another meeting I was at on Thursday. It was down at Love in the Name of Christ. And we were meeting with the Anti-Sex Trafficking Coalition, and a couple other people were involved, and people from Love, Inc., and we were talking about and the police, and we were talking about what's going on in town and who we've been working with. For example, in this parish, we've worked with 2 women who've been subject to trafficking and working in prostitution. It's a modern form of slavery. Trafficking and prostitution are not the same thing, okay? We're talking about slavery here. So we were swapping notes, talking about that and IV drug abuse and various other sort of things going on in the area. And there were 2 women in the room who said, this is not the town I grew up in. You know, I feel like I need some brain bleach. You know, this is really upsetting me. Quite natural reaction. The details were not pretty. There's a sense of that in the community. There's a sense of that in our nation now that things might be just a little bit broken. What we're trying to do from all of the best motives is fix them. But if in fixing them we're only going to deploy our own resources and say whatever happens on this horizontal dimension, we can make it happen, we'll fail. It has to involve that vertical dimension. It has to be that summary of the law which the lawyer correctly gave to Jesus, and which Jesus then says, go and do likewise, which is to first love God and say, where's God in this? If we try to fix it on our own, we'll fail. Now, if I still lived in the state of Mississippi, it might not work in Sheboygan so well, but if I still lived in the state of Mississippi and I were a police officer or a black man, I'd be in a different context. Then I'd be trying to say, okay, how do we say we're black and blue and red? And we're black and we're blue, the African American community and the police. And we're black and blue not just in our identity, but in how we've hurt each other, bruised. And we're red, because there's been some blood shed. and we're red because there's the same blood coursing through our veins in the image and likeness of Christ. Maybe we'll try a Nelson Mandela approach, and say we're not going to look back. We're going to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're going to look from this day forward, say, how do we work together to put our community back together? I can't do that as a white guy in Sheboygan, okay? As a civilian, not a police officer. But somebody in our nation, in many different parts of the nation, has to sit there and exercise some leadership. And how they're going to go about exercising this leadership, we'll see. But it's got to involve that vertical dimension. If we try to do it on our own, we'll end up at cross purposes. And we'll be worried about who's my neighbor. Who do I owe some obligation to, rather than to whom can I show love? That's going to be the equation. I need not tell you that whether it's at Love in the Name of Christ or people walking in the door here, people in need are not all sweetness and light. I get tired of them because it's the same problem and behavior doesn't change, right? And you're like, please. And while there are many other priests with far more gifts than I have in terms of compassion or whatever personality it takes to be more effective in this, they'll burn out as much as I'll burn out if we try to do it on our own. But if we say, this is God's work, and if I am faithful in doing God's work, then He will equip me in ways to do what's needed. When we sit there and look at the problems in our society and try to fix them on our own, we'll burn out. And so we'll worry about, they're not my neighbor, they're my enemy, or maybe my frenemy, or whatever it is. If we make it God's work, then there's no longer a zero-sum game of competing interests. Then we sit there and say, in seeking and serving Christ in all persons and working for justice and freedom of peace, we can also remember those other three baptismal vows about gathering in Jesus' name, about making Eucharist together, about turning back to God when we sin, about focusing on the teaching we've received from the apostles, about how the good news is proclaimed by us, not only in word, but in who we are. The best way we can fulfill the vow, for example, to say, I will proclaim the good news of God in Christ Jesus in word and deed, is in looking at anybody and saying, that's my neighbor. Because that is a person by definition that God has called me to reach out to in love, and will equip me to love even if they're not very lovable. Because it's not up to me to feel warm and fuzzy about them. Love is not a feeling here. Love is God's work in action. If we make it about how we feel, then we won't be putting black and blue and red together. We'll be saying black over here, blue over here, other folks over here, and we'll start coding each other the way we've done for way too long. The Good Samaritan is a story we all think we know. Jesus saying, go and do likewise. But let's put ourselves back in the position of the lawyer who's been told to go and do likewise, and speculate about what he did and what we'll do. The lawyer asked a question based on who's in and who's out, and Jesus says, you don't get it. It's not who's in and who's out. Everybody in God's love. Go and do likewise. If we can do that as a people, as a church, as a nation, we'll be blessed. If we can't, we'll just see more red. Now's the time for all of us to sit there and focus at any level, whether it's across the street, across the town, or across the nation, on who is my neighbor in terms of who is God calling me to reach out to. Who is God calling me to show His love to? And if I feel ill-equipped, I just need to pay attention. As Deuteronomy told us, this law is not far from you. It's on your hearts. It's on your lips. I will equip you, is what God says. Let us be equipped. Let us look at each other and say, there is one whom God calls me to love. Thanks be to God.